So this week we're going to talk about why do strategic plans fail. This is basically a condensation of the other module, which is also posted for this week. Now, this is your discussion assignment. The problem is the link doesn't work. So I've given you some other links to 3 other articles that you can read and look at. And what it comes down to is, before we get into this, a lot of there's the planning part and then there's the execution part. And in the execution part, it's about project management. And so in project management execution, it's essentially driven by 3 things. And those 3 things are, it's about your people, how much money do you have to spend, and time. And time is actually a really big factor. There have been many projects that I've turned down or not pursued, quite simply because there's just not enough time to do it. And especially when you're in a startup, time is not your friend. And so you need 2 out of 3 of these in order to do a good project. What if you can't get 2 out of 3 of these? Then what happens is quality suffers. And that's the crux of project management. Now, in terms of the failure mechanisms of strategy, it's your failure to understand who your customer is or what the market's doing. Really understanding what the issues are. An example of that, and for those of you who are taking my data-driven decision-making class, I'll talk about it this week. But for example, Epson, they were making a lot of money off of their dot matrix printers. They owned 80% of the market, and then they decided to, something? Let's make a cheap laser printer. And this was back in the days when dot matrix printers cost about $400, inkjet printers cost about $600, and laser printers cost $2,200. So they came out with a cheaper laser printer, and they thought that this would be a complement to their dot matrix. What they failed to see is that that wasn't the game. The game was about pricing and price points. And what ended up happening is HP and Canon and everybody else started dropping their prices on their laser printers. And they dropped. Now HP defended its inkjet printers. That was their bread and butter. So they separated those 2. But everything else, the price points dropped down, and it killed their dot matrix business. And they weren't prepared for that. They thought they were supplementing the product line. So they misunderstood what the market really was and what their issues really were. Also, you have to be prepared for how are they going to respond to you in terms of competition. When you make a move, you have to be anticipating what's coming at you. That strategy and tactics go hand in hand, and it's a chess game. What are your abilities to actually pull this off? Do you have, typically people underestimate what it really takes, and then it takes a very long time. In the silicon sensor business, Analog Devices thought that they were going to be out in the market in 3 to 4 years, and that they'd make a bundle. And as it turns out, it took them 10 years to get to market and to get the yield up and everything else. And so a lot of these early ventures, like the digital light projection chips, they invested over $1 billion to get those up and running. In terms of execution, now you're talking about your project management. A big part is your scope. Do you have it scoped realistically? This is actually what separates good managers from bad managers. Bad managers live in front of their computers and make estimates on what they think it can do. And good managers are actually people who go out and they see what their people are doing. They see what the capability is, and it goes into their planning. A little bit of it is like execution of technical projects. Part of the reason why my projects have always run on budget and everything else is when it comes to, and why my technology has always worked, is because not only do I understand the design side of it, I also understand the fabrication. So it's like my thesis chip yielded first shot out, and it's because I knew exactly what my process could give me. I wasn't taking specs off a sheet of paper. I actually knew what it could do, and so I designed the thing to be bulletproof, so it should have yielded. Leadership is a very big issue and tends to be underestimated. Uh, there are differences between managers and leaders. And so typically when you have good leaders, those are the people, because these are new situations, they get chaotic. So who can step in and make them actually work? How do you coordinate everything together, all the pieces? Do you have the systems in place, especially when you have multiple stakeholders? And finally, do you have a commitment, not only from the management, but from the employees? These are the primary failure mechanisms of strategy. Now, if you notice, they fall into categories. Part of it is about strategic marketing, and these are the issues that you saw in the Porter videos. The other aspect is how well in terms of project management do you execute, and then finally, how do you manage your human resources? And that gets into the leadership issue. So, for your discussion, the question becomes, is each of these a causality of why strategic management fails, or is it just a symptom of what's going on? And so walk through each of these and ask yourself, like, for example, not having enough causality, enough resources. Yeah, that's a causality issue. That you don't have enough in the tank to go ahead and do it. Now, in terms of the articles that I have attached, in red, that's what in the Forbes article that's different from what the listing I've already given you. For example, they talk about having a plan simply for plan's sake. And that's the thing, there's not a real commitment. When you make a strategic move, you have to have a commitment. And that's why in big corporations, it's so hard to make cultural changes and plan changes, because people just think, same as usual. Or it's a little like the joke about the weather in Ohio. Wait 10 minutes and it'll change to what you like. And so what the Forbes article basically gets into is something more human issues, like the level of commitment, having the right people involved, and a lot of plans. Everybody talks about it and everything gets gung-ho, and then they just put it on the shelf and it fails. And now you're getting to deeper cultural issues of your organization. Are you a strategic organization of change or not? And so you see the exact same types of topics that the Cascade article talks about. Now, interestingly, they talk about some other outside issues, such as number 3, failure to account for business as usual. And what that means is a lot of times people get so wrapped up in the new business, they forget about the old one. And your old business is your cash cow. And those cash cows you have to protect. A good example is Software Arts. Software Arts made one of the first commercially successful spreadsheets when PCs came out. And then they saw Windows, and they fell in love with Windows. And I said, this is what the future is going to be. So they didn't defend their cash cow and just focused on Windows. Meanwhile, the people who were focused on spreadsheets got pissed off, and one of them went off and started his own company. That company became Lotus 123. And that product was actually the #1 spreadsheet program. It killed his old business. Meanwhile, Windows didn't work well, meaning they would click on the icons and all of a sudden it would take like 2 minutes before the folder would open and everything like that. And that's because there wasn't enough processing power and RAM. They severely underestimated the infrastructure that existed to support it. Now, when you sit down, now at that time, Intel hadn't even started their processors yet. It wasn't until the 386 came out that there was enough processing power to do it. And if you look at Microsoft, the first successful Windows was 3.1. How many failures were there before that, before they got to 3.1? I think there was like a 2.17. Another big part of it are the tactical issues, like your willingness to iterate. And that's that your strategy is not written in stone. You have to experiment with it. You have to try different things. And then there's a touchy-feely thing that you have to reward your people, that you have to celebrate your successes. So in terms of strategic planning, you typically go through 3 phases. The first one is the intuitive phase. And this is where people kind of get a feel for what you're doing. And then after that, you need to start getting to your analytical phase, and that's what is your long-term planning? How is we going to make this happen? And then you get into your operational planning, and that has to do with the tactical results. And so your job right now is to sit down and look at each of these factors and talk about whether or not they're causality in terms of strategic planning, or are they just characteristics and symptoms of basically bad execution?